Hi, my name is Dean Smith, and in this podcast, I want to ask the question, does the Bible speak of nuclear warfare in the end times? Now, we need to understand that the Bible is a very prophetic book. I mean, it had dozens of prophets. And many of them were prophesying events that they said would be taking place at a future time. Many of these prophecies were being fulfilled in their lifetime, but there were another set of prophecies that spoke of future end-time events that would be taking place thousands of years in the future. Joel called it the coming day of the Lord. Amos described it as the day that is night, and others referred to it as the time of Jacob's trouble. In the New Testament, the prophets spoke of it as the end times or the apocalypse. Now, one thing we need to understand is that many of these prophets were seers, and by that I mean they were seeing visions of events that would be taking place at a future date. Of course, if the events were being fulfilled in their lifetime, there was no big issue. But what if it was talking about events that were taking place thousands of years in the future? For example, how would they describe a Russian R-28 Sarmat intercontinental missile when the most advanced weapons of their day were swords and spears? How would they talk about the devastation of a nuclear battle? How would they describe it? Basically, these prophets had to describe these events with non-technological vocabulary. So as we're looking at these passages, we have to be looking for other clues that may be describing nuclear war or nuclear devastation. The first involves an end times battle against Israel that would involve Gog and Magog and several other nations who would come and attack the nation of Israel. Now, Gog was the name of the king. Magog was the name of the major country that was participating in this battle. We don't know that much about Magog. All we know, we got a few details, like, for example, Ezekiel 38, verse 15, describes Magog as being located in the outer parts of the north. In fact, it says that, it implies in the Hebrew that it's in the outer, that there could be no further north that you could get. Of course, in looking at Israel today, the other parts of the north would be Russia. And of course, Russia, we know, has been very antagonistic towards Israel and involved in several conflicts in the Middle East in recent years. We have other references, such as in Daniel chapter 7, verse 4, where the prophet describes Magog as a bear, which is interesting because at times the bear has been used as an image to represent Russia, as we've seen in the 1980 Olympics, where the bear was incorporated into their logo. Then in Ezekiel 38, verse 1, the prophet refers to the Prince of Rosh, a term found only here describing Magog. Now, Rosh, of course, is similar to Russia. Is that what the prophet was saying? Is this what he was saying? And it was his interpretation of that term? We don't know for sure. We all know that Russia has a massive nuclear arsenal. And recently, the University of Princeton in the U.S. decided to take a look at what would happen during a nuclear battle between the United States and Russia because of the recent breakdown in nuclear agreements between the two countries. The scenario starts with a border conflict between NATO and Russia and ends up with Russia launching 300 nuclear missiles, NATO responding with 180, and the U.S. launching 600 missiles, nuclear weapons. And during this conflict, they estimated that 90 million people would die. So we know that Russia has nuclear weapons. We note even today they're actively involved in the affairs of the Middle East. And so would these nuclear weapons be used in a battle in the Middle East? Now, there are a number of passages that describe this Gog-Magog battle against Israel. The first thing we read is in Isaiah 17, verse 14, that the battle will be over in a matter of hours. And in fact, that's exactly what Princeton said. And we read in Isaiah chapter 17, verse 14, at evening time, behold, there is terror. Before morning, they are no more. Such will be the portion of those who plunder us, and the lot of those who pillage us. Some translations describe it as sudden terror, and by morning, all the armies are gone. No one's left. Secondly, the prophet Isaiah refers to a very interesting thing. Now, he saw people like again, it's a vision. So he saw people fleeing from the fortified cities, or from the cities, and going and hiding in caves, and he specifically says underground. In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 19, we read, "Men will go into caves of the rocks and into holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord." Now, this is a bit unusual, because during this time, people tended to flee to the fortified cities for protection, not away from them. But in this prophecy, Isaiah saw them fleeing from the cities, hiding in caves, and going underground. And here's the curious things. Notice how he said that they would go underground. They would actually be digging holes in the ground, it appears, because going underground is different from hiding in caves. We're talking about them actually digging holes. Now, it may be just a coincidence, but going underground does describe what happened during the Cold War back in the 60s and 70s. We saw nation after nation building huge underground bunkers where people could flee to, when, particularly government leaders, could flee to when the nation was under nuclear attack. Cheyenne Mountain, built in the 1960s, of course, is a huge underground complex built primarily for a hiding place from nuclear attack. Is this what Isaiah was seeing? I mean, he was talking about people hiding in caves, but then he saw during this end times devastation, this end times Gog-Magog battle, that people would be fleeing underground, going into these underground bunkers. Is this what he was actually seeing? Like I said, sometimes they're finding words to try to describe what they're seeing, and so we have to pick up clues. So is this a clue? This going underground, is this something that we would associate with nuclear war? Well, it certainly is, but is this what Isaiah was seeing? Then Isaiah describes the aftermath of this massive Gog-Magog battle with Israel. We read in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10, "For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light." As we read this verse, we have to ask ourselves the question, is Isaiah describing the aftermath of a nuclear battle, where there would be multiple nuclear strikes, and the smoke and the dust and the sulfur caused by these massive explosions is sending particles into the air that begin to block the sun and block the moon and could hang in the air for months? Now, there's a second possible mention of nuclear war, and it's found in the book of Zechariah. Again, we have to just keep this in mind, that he's trying to find words to describe what he's seeing. Now, it's possible Zechariah was again referring to the Gog and Magog battle. It's not completely clear, but many people suspect he was. But I wanted to separate this from the other passages because it's quite distinctive in the way it describes what happens during this battle. Now, here's what Zechariah writes in chapter 14, verse 12. "Now, this will be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the people who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongue will rot in their mouth." Now, we need to understand that Israel has nuclear weapons as well. So if these countries that were arrayed against Israel were coming and attacking with nuclear weapons, there's a distinct possibility that Israel would respond in kind. They would launch their nuclear weapons as well. And so what Zechariah was seeing, he was seeing that their flesh will rot while they stand and on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongue will rot as well. So he was seeing basically flesh and tongues and eyes falling off people. So Zechariah, this is what he saw. This is the vision that he had. So now he had to find a word to describe this. And the word he used was plague, because it was the closest thing that he could come up with that people would understand. Because in the ancient times, in Israel's day, one of the most feared plagues of that time, of course, was leprosy, where people would actually have their noses fall off and their fingers fall off. So when he saw people were having their flesh falling off them, their eyes and their tongues rotting as they stood, the first word that would come to his mind would be plague. This is from him trying to describe it, he says it's a plague. But there's one big significant difference. And that difference is that it would happen so fast that their flesh and their eyes and everything would fall off them while they were still standing. It was an instantaneous event. So, of course, in Zechariah's day, there was nothing that was functioning like that at that time. But he was just using words to describe what he was saying. So we have to ask ourselves, what was Zechariah saying? Was it possible that he was seeing the devastation caused by a nuclear blast, where the explosion would happen and cause such that people's skin or flesh would be literally ripped off their bodies while they were still standing? Well, that's what he saw. Is he referring to nuclear devastation? Well, that's up for you to decide. But it's also interesting, after this battle in Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8 to 9, Zechariah, the prophet, says that 2/3 of Israel will be killed, and the 1/3 that remains will turn to God. So 1/3 of the people will survive this nuclear attack, if that's what he's describing. And they will turn to God, turn to Jesus. And this may have been what Paul was referring to in Romans chapter 11, 26, when he said that there was a time coming when Israel would be saved. Now, there's a third description of a possible nuclear attack found in the book of Revelation, which is a written version of a vision of the end times that the Apostle John had while banished on the island of Patmos towards the end of the 1st century. In his vision, he saw several things happening in the end times, including, what he described as what looks to be asteroids slamming into the earth. For example, he describes one as being the size of a giant mountain. He describes it as a flaming mountain that crashes into the ocean. Of course, there would be several tsunamis that would come out of this, and it destroyed thousands and thousands of ships. But there's a third passage that some refer to, that some believe that's also a description of an asteroid, but I think there's evidence to suggest that it also is referring to a nuclear warhead or nuclear missile and possibly a nuclear attack. It's found in Revelation chapter 8, and we'll read it. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers, on the springs of waters. The name of the star is called Wormwood, and 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. Revelation chapter 8, verses 10 to 11. So as we look at this passage, we see that it has the appearance of an asteroid because it's a flaming object, again, flying down from the sky and hitting Earth. But John does something very different. He gives it the ominous name of wormwood. And by doing this, I think he's trying to say this is different from the other things I was saying coming from the sky. Now, wormwood was a plant used at this time in the Middle East that was used for both medicinal purposes and as well as for a poison. It was actually used for a poison as well. So how would a prophet who was living 2,000 years ago, for example, describe the Russian-made RT-2 PM-2 Topol-M intercontinental missile? How would he describe it? Again, he has no words in his vocabulary that even come close to it. So how would the Apostle John describe an intercontinental ballistic missile that actually leaves the Earth's atmosphere and then comes back in to launch multiple nuclear warheads? Of course, as it came back in, it would be flaming like the rocks or any meteor that comes into the Earth's atmosphere. So what does John do? He doesn't know. He's trying to describe what he's seeing, and he says it's an elongated torch. It looks like a torch that's burning. That's what he describes it as. Then he does another interesting thing, and he says that when it hit, he says that the ground became like wormwood. In other words, whatever this flaming torch was, whatever it was, when it hit, it transferred whatever it was. It was called wormwood, and it transferred this wormwood onto the earth. So what is he describing? Is it possible he's describing a nuclear weapon that when it hits the earth, it explodes, causes nuclear radiation? Because he's saying the earth became like what wormwood was. The third thing he does, which I found interesting, is that he said it particularly impacted the waters. That's what he noticed. He said it made the waters become wormwood, and it caused people to die. Why is John's focus on water interesting? Because on April 26, 1986, a nuclear reactor disaster in Chernobyl, which was then the Soviet Union and today modern Ukraine, resulted in a nuclear chain reaction that caused a massive fire to spew out radiation, contaminating a large area around the reactor. But what was interesting about it is that there was the concern about the impact that this radiation would have on water. In fact, Wikipedia has dedicated an entire separate section entitled Chernobyl Groundwater Contamination to describe the impact that this disaster had on the water supply. Wikipedia writes, "Substantial groundwater contamination is one of the greatest environmental impacts caused by the Chernobyl disaster. As part of this overall freshwater damage, it relates to so-called secondary contamination caused by the delivery of radioactive materials through unconfined aquifers to the groundwater network." So is it just a coincidence that John said he saw a flaming torch, a long flaming torch? Is it just a coincidence that he said that whatever this long flaming torch was, wormwood, it contaminated the world with wormwood? And is it just a coincidence that he was describing the impact that it particularly had on water? Is he describing a nuclear missile? Who knows? That's up to you to decide. I am not adamant that these passages are describing nuclear devastation. These are just my opinions. You have to study them yourselves and come to your own conclusions. I think they might be, but that's for you to decide. Again, thanks for listening to this podcast, and we'll talk to you again.